Rangkaian kegiatan pertemuan jalur keuangan KTT G20 telah dimulai. Bank Dunia sebagai lembaga yang berperan aktif memberikan dukungan dana kepada negara-negara terhadap berbagai isu global hadir untuk menyukseskan agenda tersebut. Berbagai tantangan mewarnai agenda pemulihan ekonomi dunia di masa pandemi COVID-19. Bank Dunia pun perlu menerapkan strategi demi menjawab tantangan pemulihan ekonomi yang merata serta masalah keuangan global seperti pemerataan akses kesehatan serta tantangan perubahan iklim. Bagaimana Bank Dunia menjawab berbagai tantangan tersebut? Kami bahas dalam special interview with Axel van Trotsenburg, Managing Director of Operations, World Bank. Yeah, joining with us today, Mr. Axel van Trotsenburg, the Managing Director of Operation at the World Bank. Mr. van Trotsenburg, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm happy to be back in Indonesia and have had my first day of meetings.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time with CNN Indonesia. We really appreciate it. So, before we jump to our main topic, Mr. van Trotsenburg, how do you see so far the COVID-19 pandemic mitigation here in Indonesia?
Well, I think Indonesia has been very successful on rolling out the vaccination campaign and has now about almost 69% of the population vaccinated. And that compares very well with other countries. I think also that Indonesia has taken a comprehensive view, not only in terms of covering also children and the entire population, but also for the healthcare system so that the delivery is actually guaranteed. Clearly, I think that Indonesia is also affected, like many other countries, by the Omicron that has unfortunately created a lot of problems in the whole world. But I think what is the good news is, and coming now from the United States, is that Omicron is first milder in its effect, and secondly, it tends to go up and then it goes down very fast.
Right, there are still a lot of homework to be done in this Omicron phase. Mr. van Trotsenburg, we've seen that the pandemic COVID-19 brings a lot of challenges to the world economy recovery. For instance, the inequality of economic growth, vaccine supplies, as well as the health infrastructure or access. However, this pandemic also increased the inclusivity of digitalizations around the world in so many ways. It could be both challenge and also advantage. Talking about those challenges and advantage, how do you see it?
Well, I think starting with your first point is about the economy and the economic impact. Clearly, what we are seeing is that the whole world has suffered enormously, but the recovery has been uneven, meaning that particularly the richer countries have had a stronger recovery. I think Asia has had also a fairly good recovery, while the poorest countries have been lagging behind. And this has created greater inequality for which we need to watch. What is also important is with COVID is that we will need first to get really over it. So that means we still need to continue with the vaccination campaign and see that we really can overcome this pandemic. But then we need to think of how to improve pandemic preparedness. And that is going to be a global challenge, and in which also a lot of discussions are going on in the G20 context. I think the final word is certainly in the case of Indonesia. The difficulties most countries have faced is, and how they have managed. Actually, Indonesia has done very well in terms of managing this crisis from an economic perspective, particularly also from a fiscal perspective. The country has done it in such a way that it is now recovering strongly. We are expecting a growth of over 5% in this year, and which is very good news. But also that the country has managed the crisis in a fiscally very responsible manner, and I think the country has to be congratulated for that.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the point you've just stated about the uneven economic growth and also the vaccination. But before we jump to that question, how does the pandemic COVID-19 impact the work of the World Bank in terms of funding for the beneficiary countries?
It has had a massive impact on this. During crisis, we have learned we have to be fast, and we have to be also providing large amounts of financial support to the countries, and we have to do that with determination, meaning we have to do this swiftly and support wherever we can. And the result has been that in the last 2 years, the World Bank has provided about $135 billion in financial support. That is a surge of financing of close to $50 billion. And about 40% of these resources went for COVID support. That was health support, was also education support, it was also social protection support. So in many areas we have been providing support. Particular attention was also given to the poorest countries, where we have actually expanded the most to provide the necessary support. This has clearly impacted us in terms of our resource availability, particularly for the poorest countries. And so we have, normally for the poorest countries, we mobilize on a 3-year basis money. And so we actually spent the money that we had for 3 years in 2 years. So we have replenished this fund for the poorest in December with a record replenishment of 93 billion. So it is clearly we have made all these efforts. What's also important is that despite the health crisis and all the challenges that it posed, we never forgot also on our longer-term mission, namely long-term development support, long-term support for climate change. Those areas also continued to get sufficient attention and actually record funding.
Hundreds of billions that are already delivered to the needed country or beneficiary countries for the health and also the infrastructure. Mr. van Trotsenburg, so in terms to providing those large amount of funding for the beneficiary countries, what are the challenges that the World Bank need to address in terms of delivering a COVID-19 financing strategy?
Well, the biggest challenge is, of course, that as you see, we are not together in the studio together. It is one of the challenges is that we have to do and deliver this remotely. And this has been certainly not easy. One advantage is that over the last 2 decades, we have aggressively decentralized our operations. Today, 55% of our operational staff are in about 140 countries. And that was certainly a key to the success of our ability to respond fast and decisively to the needs of the countries. What is also important is that in helping countries, we had, of course, our fair amount of challenges in getting last year in the vaccines to the countries, and particularly the poorest countries had huge problems to get access to the necessary vaccines. And as a result, you see the inequality. I was just talking about that Indonesia has vaccinated 69% of the population. Compare that with barely 5% fully vaccinated in the poorest countries. So there is a big difference, and I think that difference is not acceptable, and that was certainly a big challenge we have been dealing with, and I think we still need to make a lot more progress in making sure that when a pandemic strikes the world, we cannot have such inequalities as we have seen under COVID.
Mr. van Trotsenburg, we will talk more about the vaccine supplies and also the other economic issues shortly after the break, so please stay with us. CNN Indonesia Special Interview akan kembali sesaat lagi. Anda masih bersama CNN Indonesia Special Interview bersama dengan Axel van Trotsenburg, Managing Directors of Operations dari Bank Dunia atau World Bank. So, Mr. Axel van Trotsenburg, in response to COVID-19 vaccinations, how do you portray the challenges to fulfill the quality of distribution of vaccinations across the globe?
Well, I think what we have seen is the distribution followed a pattern that initially everybody wanted to avoid, namely that everybody should get equal access to the vaccines. That didn't happen. In the beginning of last year, mainly the industrialized countries had first access and actually had often also more vaccines available than needed. And then actually the middle income countries followed suit and actually organized the vaccination campaigns as well as the purchase of vaccines themselves. The ones who actually were left behind were the low-income countries. Often they didn't have also the resources. And what we saw here is that they were at the end of the queue. And that has been a huge concern to the World Bank because it is not equal treatment, but also it left a lot of people very, very vulnerable.
Mr. Axel, speaking of the severity of COVID-19 effects on the socio-economic side, what is your projection to the poverty effect of the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, the world has made enormous progress over the last 2 decades to reduce absolute poverty, and there has been a steady decline. What COVID has done is has stopped or at least temporarily reversed this decline. And our estimate showed that the impact of COVID was that over 120 million people fell back into extreme poverty. And that is a very, very serious matter on which we will need to stay very much focused to, again, bring this back to pre-pandemic times. Secondly, what we have also been seeing is the devastating effect on education. Many kids, because of the lockdown, didn't go to school, and quite a few, and in fact millions of kids, are likely not going to return to school. And particularly girls are affected of this. So one of the tragedies of this crisis is that it can have long-lasting effects on kids going to school and ultimately have less education. That means less earning potential, and therefore also potentially less success in their professional lives, and that we have been highlighting. Another aspect that concerns is that with the normal focus on COVID, a lot of focus has been lost on the Sustainable Development Goals. And here we have, again, also to step up and reverse the lack of progress that was made over the last 2 years.
Okay, so we absolutely need to avoid, the generation loss because of the education that causing from the extreme poverty because of the COVID-19. Anyway, when we're talking about the, poverty, maybe it can be the results of the uneven economic growth itself. Then we talk about the inflations that vary amongst nations. How does your organization address that financial gap?
Well, I think our gap is we are looking at the needs of all developing countries, and there we differentiate between the low-income countries, the middle-income countries, and the upper middle-income countries. clearly, the ones who are most affected by financial concerns and access to concessional finance like grants are the low-income countries, and that has been something that we have been highlighted. These countries don't have the ability to access capital markets and to issue bonds, and therefore they have limited financial means and still enormous challenges at home to finance. So that is one of the areas where we have been highlighted. This is also one of the reasons why we provided so much extra support to the low-income countries and mobilized the $93 billion I just mentioned for the Fund for the Poorest. For the middle-income countries, also, I think they have not the capabilities of high-income countries to indebt themselves to the extent as OECD countries did, but still they were able to access markets and in that sense manage the crisis in relative. It depends in a way depending on where they were. For example, in Latin America was badly affected by this crisis and also economically had large contractions to suffer off. So their recovery has been a lot more difficult. I think in Asia it has been a better picture, certainly as you compare that to other regions in the world. But I think we need to be vigilant. First, we need to make sure that the recovery is permanent. And secondly, once it is permanent, that then the large fiscal deficits are again brought under control.
Okay, to make sure the recovery is permanent. Mr. Axel van Trotsenburg, small business sector that faces the biggest challenge, in the pandemic. What do you say about their prospect for the time being and in the future? Don't answer it yet. We must break for a while, so stay with us. Kita akan kembali membahas soal berbagai tantangan yang harus dihadapi oleh Indonesia dan juga dunia bersama dengan Mr. Directors of Operation dari World Bank. So, Mr. Axel, yeah, we were talking about the SME sector that needs the the concern of the World Bank because small businesses, SMEs, this is a sector that faces very big challenges in this pandemic. What do you say about their prospect for the time being and in the future?
Well, the SMEs are the backbone of any economy because they are creating most of the employment, and these small and medium-sized enterprises really employ the bulk of women and men in society. So clearly, during a crisis, this is a difficult challenge for them. Often, they don't have sufficient access to financing and need some additional support. In this context, what we have been doing as a World Bank, we have also a private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation, where we have been providing through special program support for SMEs. What we, of course, see is that there is support during the crisis, but more fundamentally, these are sectors where we need to give particular attention to because they create new employment. So what we need to make also sure is that through in incentives here, these people are using their entrepreneurial spirits and create new enterprises and actually create new jobs.
Yeah, it relates to the unemployment or job protection. So in terms of that, about the job protection, what kind of financial aid or program that the World Bank can offer to at least depressing the level of unemployment in a nation?
Well, what we are doing is in many forms is where the World Bank is busy. We do it is one is often through regulatory or policy reforms in order to provide advice to governments how to incentivize them, so that sometimes the regulatory framework is not conducive enough for the creation of new SMEs. That is one. Secondly, we are working with the authority on tax initiatives, so that actually also the taxation is incentivize the creation of SMEs. Third, we are providing support in training. This is particularly on-the-job training, so that we are giving TA assistance to government on this. Fourth, we do also a lot of work with the governments on comparative studies, so to compare and benchmark a little bit how, for example, in Indonesia, it is doing vis-a-vis other ASEAN countries or other middle-income countries for that matter. And then we are using our partners of the International Finance Corporation that are directly investing in SMEs, or also providing concrete technical support in order to foster new creation of companies, or also providing the necessary financing so that they can actually continue to innovate and create jobs.
So, talking about those climate change, Ivek, what are the essential factors for implementing sustainable climate investment, both in developing or in poor countries?
Well, I think the needs are enormous. I think so everybody needs to be engaged and try to support developing countries in these efforts. What is a good basis is that in the negotiation on climate change, every country is developing a national plan that they are communicating on how they are intending to ramp up investments on climate financing. And what the World Bank has been doing is try to be a very active supportive of climate financing. We have been actually quite strong. Last year, we had a record of $25 billion in climate financing. What we are expecting is basic for the next 4 years, another $100 billion of climate-related financing. And this sounds a lot, but in the global context, it is not. I think what we need is that all need to increase their efforts. What I mean with all is not only multilateral organizations, our governments have to do more, but also the private sector has to be. Because the private sector has to be a key part in the solutions of it. Governments alone cannot do it. It will need to be an effort by all. And I think certainly the World Bank wants to be a very, very active participant in these efforts to deal with climate change.
So what do you suggest to the beneficiary countries to implement best practices of climate investment in the nation, in the country, to receiving the fund from the World Bank?
Well, that depends on the individual countries. But take, for example, in the case of Indonesia, I think there are two big areas where international support can be provided. One is on the energy transition, and in the second is, for example, the whole mangroves rehabilitation. These are, as you know, in Indonesia, in the agricultural sector as well as in the forestry sector, there is a lot of CO2 emissions, and I think there are measures that can be taken that can significantly improve the situation. Equally, in the energy transition, here is the big challenge in Indonesia is to increase decisively the renewable energy available. And that requires not only support by the government and the private sector, but it could also usefully get international support, such as from the World Bank. We are certainly prepared to do a large program in the energy transition, but also in support of projects like mangrove rehabilitation, where we would provide actually quite significant financing. We expect, certainly in the energy transition, to be willing to provide over the next 4 or 5 years, $5 billion.
Mr. Axel van Trotsenburg, we hope that everything you bring or leaders bring to the G20 table can achieve the mutual cooperations amongst the world leaders and also the consensus that benefits all the stakeholders, nations, no matter developing, emerging, and also the poorest country. Thank you very much, Mr. Axel van Trotsenburg, Managing Director of Operations of the World Bank. We wish you enjoy your time in Indonesia. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Ya, dan demikian CNN Indonesia Special Interview dengan Axel van Trotsenburg, Managing Director of Operation World Bank. Saya Aldi Hawari. Sampai jumpa.